We're going to finish up Chapter 13 today and look at the fourth principle of experimental design and then some more complicated experimental designs. The fourth principle of experimental design is called blocking. So a block is the ability of randomizing to equalize variation across the treatment groups so that it works best in the long run. For example, if we have 12 kids and we want 2 soccer teams with 6 players each, we can evenly divide 12 kids into 6, no problem. The issue here is that 2 of those 12 kids are 12 years old, and the rest of them are only 6. It would be unfair if one of the teams had both of the 12-year-olds on it, because they're clearly going to be better than the 6-year-olds. So what we can do in this case is we can randomly put each 12-year-old onto one of the teams and then randomly put 5 6-year-olds on each of those teams as well. This way it makes the teams more fair in the short run because each team will have a 12-year-old and each team will have 5 6-year-olds. By doing this, we call the variable age a blocking variable. The levels of age are then called the blocks. Sometimes attributes of the experimental unit we are not studying can have an effect. So by grouping similar individuals and then randomizing within each block, we can remove some of that variability. Unlike the other 3 principles, blocking is not required in an experimental design. Continuing to look at blocking, suppose in our tomato experiment we wanted to use 18 plants. Suppose that the garden store we went to only had 12, so we went down the road to another store and we bought the last 6. To ensure that the store will not have an effect on our experiment, we'll put them into blocks. By blocking them, we are isolating the variability of the differences between the blocks. We would randomly assign the 12 from the first store to each of the different treatment groups, then randomly assign 6 from the second store to each of the different treatment groups. This ends up giving us 6 different treatment groups. Because each plant was only randomized within their block, this is called a randomized block design. So this is what a diagram of this would look like. So we're starting out with 18 tomatoes, 12 from store A and 6 from store B. Then we're going to have block A, which has our 12 tomato plants, and block B, which has our 6 tomato plants. From there, we do random assignment, and again, it's not enough just to state that it's random assignment. You do have to explain how you are performing that random assignment. But then we end up putting 4 plants into group 1, 4 into group 2, 4 into group 3. For our second block, we only put 2 plants within each group. Those groups apply to the different treatments. So all in all, we do end up with 6 plants as a control, 6 with the half dose and 6 with the full dose. But we're going to compare the 2 different groups separately to compare the juiciness and tastiness of those tomatoes, just to ensure that the store we bought them from doesn't affect our outcome. Continuing to look at blocking can be applied to observational studies as well. In retrospective or prospective studies, subjects may be paired together because they are similar in ways that are not under study. Instead of being called blocking, we actually call this matching. For example, in a retrospective study of music education and grades, we might match students who play the same instrument with somebody of the same sex and family income, but didn't play an instrument. When comparing grades of music students to grades of non-music students, this reduces the variation due to income or gender differences, which could have an effect. Blocking is the same idea as stratifying, but it gets 3 different names depending on the type of study you're doing. In an experiment, it's blocking. In an observational study, it's matching. And in a survey, it's stratifying. Sometimes in an experiment, we have to add more factors, meaning that we're testing more than one thing. Continuing with our tomato example, there are 2 different types of gardeners, those who water and those who leave it up to Mother Nature. Suppose that Optigrow wants to make sure their product works for both types of gardeners. So we want to include the amount of watering to our experiment. This gives us 2 factors, which then gives us 6 treatments. The amount of fertilizer, the amount of water are our 2 factors. Our treatments are going to be no water, so we're leaving it up to Mother Nature, and our control for the fertilizer. no water with our half dose, and no water with our full dose. The other 3 treatments are we'll water daily and have our control, water daily and have our half dose, and water daily with our full dose. You can always determine how many treatments you're going to have because you'll multiply number of levels for each factor together. So we had 3 factors for the fertilizer and 2 factors for the water. 3 times 2 is 6. Therefore, we have 6 treatment groups. The following diagram shows what this would look like. Group 1, each of the groups have 2 plants in them. The first treatment is control with no water, half dose no water, full dose no water, control with water, half dose with water, full dose with water. And then again, we can compare the juiciness and tastiness of each of those different treatment groups by tasting the tomatoes when they're ripe. So the last thing that we really need to talk about with experiments is confounding. Confounding is not part of a design. It's actually something we want to avoid. It's similar to having bias within a survey. Confounding normally does occur, though, when you have a bad experimental design. So you want to make sure that you do think through your design. This occurs when the levels of one factor are associated with the levels of another factor. Then the 2 factors can be said to be confounded. For example, a psychology professor wanted to know if the delivery of his material affected how well the students learned. So one semester, in the first semester, the fall that ends in December, he talked in a monotone, was not animated, just came in, delivered his material. He still taught, so he answered questions as necessary, but it was kind of very boring. In the spring semester, he taught the exact same class, but this time he taught it in an animated way. He got excited about the material. He made the class more fun. At the end of both semesters, he had the students fill out a survey, and then he compared the results from the survey from the first semester to the survey of the second semester. The issue that we have here is that the semester could have an effect. The fall semester ends in the winter, when it's dark and cold and gloomy, and typically that makes us less happy. So even though he did the monotone that semester, the fact that the students may not have liked that could have something to do with the fact of that it's winter and cold and dark and gloomy. The next semester is the spring semester, which ends going into summer, and the days are longer and there's more sunlight, and people are typically happier at this time. So even though, yes, he taught more animatedly this semester, again, the fact that people are generally more happy could also have affected his survey. So we would call the teaching style and as well as the semester confounding variables, because both could have an effect on the results. So we would want the psychology professor should really have taught the same class with the same semester 2 different ways and then compared the results. That would eliminate the confounding variable. Confounding can also occur with a really poor design or a multi-factor experiment. For example, say a credit card company sent out applications for a credit card. They sent out 2 different types of applications, one that had a low rate with a low fee, and one that had a high rate with a high fee. They found out that more people signed up for the card with a low rate and low fee. This clearly makes sense. There's multi-factors here, so there really should have been 4 treatment groups, not 2, because we should have had a low rate, low fee, low rate, high fee, high rate, low fee, and high rate, high fee, and then figured out which one was best. So let's look at what we have learned. We know the principles of experimental design, so we know we need to identify and control as many sources of variability as possible, so the variation in the response variable can be attributed to our factor. We know we need to equalize as many possible sources of variability that cannot be identified, and we do this by random assignment of experimental units to the treatments. We know we need to replicate the experiment on as many subjects as possible, and we need to control the sources of variability that we can, and consider if we need to block to reduce that variability from sources we recognize but cannot control. We also can recognize problems posed by confounding variables in experiments and lurking variables in observational studies. That is it for Chapter 13. Have a great night, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.